Thanks, and welcome back from the break. I'm Samir Cleave. Currently, I'm a biomedical scholar and professor of oncology and the director of the Center of Immunology and Immunotherapy at Georgetown. I'm also a member of the National Cancer Policy Forum and of SITC, the Society for Immunotherapy of Cancer. I will be co-moderating this session, which is going to be on learning rapidly to improve cancer clinical research beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll be co-moderating it with Donna Rivera. Dr. Donna Rivera is the Associate Director of Pharmacoepidemiology at the Oncology Center of Excellence at the FDA. In this session, we will explore opportunities to leverage the lessons we've learned from our experience with the clinical research during the pandemic in order to improve the current conduct of cancer research and to take that for future. We begin the session with a keynote from Doug Lowy. Doug is the Principal Deputy Director of the National Cancer Institute and an old friend. Following the keynote, we will hear from Paul Klutz, who is the Deputy Director of Oncology Center of Excellence at the FDA. We will hear from Khaled Abdullah, who is the Senior Vice President and Head of Worldwide Medical Oncology at BMS. Elizabeth Garrett Mayer, who is the Director of the Division of Biostatistics and Research Data Governance within the Center of Research and Analytics at the American Society of Clinical Oncology. Also, we have Derek Angus, who's the Chief Innovation Officer and the Executive Vice President at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, and Randall Heyer, who is the Senior Vice President of Global Medical Affairs at Moderna. And finally, last but not least, we will hear from Rob Califf, who is currently the head of the clinical policy and strategy for Verily and Google Health, and he's the former FDA commissioner. Just a few reminders before we start. One, bios are available in the briefing book that's posted on the workshop website. The presentations have been pre-recorded and will play consecutively. After the last presentation, we will begin a live panel discussion. And please use the chat box on our website to ask questions. And then thank you very much. And we'll start with Dr. Lowy.
Hello, everyone. I'm pleased to be here today to participate in this session, which really is trying to put into practice what have we learned from the COVID-19 pandemic that can help us going forward. If I can have the next slide, it simply tells you that I have no disclosures related to this presentation. If we go to the next slide, this really summarizes the overview of the kinds of improvements that we think could and should be made following the pandemic. One would be to shorten the time needed to develop and initiate clinical trials, recognizing to the extent feasible, because sometimes there are desirable efforts, but there could be complications. Second is to bring the trial to the patient rather than the patient to the trial, again, to the extent feasible. Third, participation in a clinical trial should bring hope for people with cancer rather than additional burdens for them to the extent feasible. And fourth, trials should be accessible for all, including patients in rural areas as well as underserved minorities. I'll now go into a few specifics and then end with a slide about some specific recommendations that we might consider undertaking. Next slide, please. The NCI did a survey of 223 investigators involved in NCI clinical trials last year and received a 42% response rate. And these are some of the areas that people were enthusiastic about. If you look on the right, you'll see that these were either 3.9 or higher, with 5 being very useful. And so this was working with local healthcare providers to provide continuity of care for patients on trials, using virtual telehealth and telephone for study visits, shipping oral IND agents directly to the enrolled patients, using remote informed consent to enroll patients, and to undergo remote auditing. So these are just some of the highlights from that survey. Next slide is one of 3 slides that deal with telehealth research needs. I realize that we have had a session devoted to telehealth research needs, but this is a very important area that is worth focusing on. According to Paul Jacobson from the NCI, who presented in that session, support for telehealth research needs to identify care contexts optimally suited to use for telehealth, to test innovative approaches to combining synchronous and asynchronous communication. By synchronous is meant in real time, and asynchronous is meant sequential communication. Third, to demonstrate how telehealth can reduce disparities and improve care access. And fourth, to yield scalable, transferable, and sustainable models of telehealth that improve quality of care, healthcare utilization, and health outcome. Next slide. This is a slide about Centers for Telehealth Research and Cancer Care related care that is closing just before this conference. But the goal is to create centers to advance a national center-focused telehealth research agenda in changing the healthcare environment. Establish research infrastructures to facilitate testing of telehealth models of care in real-world settings, and to promote the development, evaluation, and dissemination of evidence-based models of telehealth. Next slide. This slide depicts for you some current telehealth NOCs from NCI, and it gives you the URL for where those NOCs are, and they are continuing to be available at least through the middle of next year, with some of them being available actually through 2024. Next slide. This slide is, I think, quite surprising, because we have all been very concerned that there would be a decrease in the enrollment in trials of minorities. And what I'm depicting here are data from Dr. Warder McCaskill Stevens from NCI, who has compiled this information. The column on the left shows you the enrollment for the 3 years between 2017 and 2019. And the column on the right shows you the enrollment for 2020. What can be appreciated is that the majority enrollment went from 71% down to 64% between the 3 years prior to 2020 and 2020. And therefore, minority enrollment in 2020 actually increased from 25% to 34%. The rate of enrollment was very similar for Black patients, but for Hispanic patients, there essentially was a doubling in 2020 of their enrollment into trials compared to the average of the 3 prior years, and other minority groups remained the same. Next slide. This slide really shows you some specific lessons from COVID-19 that we think could be implemented. The first category is to improve operational efficiency and reduce costs. This could be with remote and electronic consenting, trial care visits close to home, and giving drugs to the patient. New trial designs to reduce the number of required data elements and/or testing that will decrease resource utilization, to enable rapid review of clinical trial documents, and add core infrastructure to facilitate electronic data capture from electronic health records. The second category is to modernize regulatory requirements. Stop collecting minor protocol deviations and reduce reporting of adverse events that end up having no impact on patient safety. Simplify study endpoints. And the third part, to bring trials to more patients and lower barriers to trial entry, increase trial sites for the underserved, and to reevaluate comorbidities that tend to stifle accrual. Dr. Jim Doroshow in 2021, in July, gave a talk about this, and the URL is shown at the bottom here for those of you who want more information. So I look forward to this session continuing, and this is really the tip of the iceberg of the opportunities that we have for making progress as a result of lessons learned from COVID-19. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Paul Klutz, and I'm a medical oncologist serving as the Deputy Director for the Oncology Center of Excellence at the US FDA. And I'd like to thank the National Academies for inviting me to speak with you all today on this panel where we're going to discuss efforts to learn from COVID-19 and how we can expand opportunities for robust evidence generation. I have no financial relationships to disclose, and I think I'd like to start this conversation by using a slide that I've adapted from Teresa Mullen, who is responsible at FDA for responding to the patient-focused drug development effort. And as you can see from the slide, Dr. Mullen noticed that we can incorporate patients all along the drug development continuum. And really a lot of the focus was on identifying outcomes that matter to patients, measuring those outcomes, and then using those results in our risk-benefit decision, and then communicating that patient experience data from trials. But patient-focused drug development isn't only symptom and functional measure, it's also making trials more patient-friendly, and it's also identifying ways to efficiently generate data, both in the pre and the post-marketing setting. And I think COVID-19 really helped catalyze those two patient-focused evidence generation concepts. So with respect to how we make trials more patient-friendly, there's several areas of interest in the Oncology Center that, again, COVID-19 has helped catalyze. We are interested in advancing digital health technology and patient-generated data. And as we look at digital health, we know that that can also help us decentralize clinical trials, another area of interest, by allowing for remote assessments and bringing trials closer to where patients live. With both of those, we begin to start to look at how to foster learning healthcare systems that can facilitate generating evidence from the actual healthcare systems themselves. And this can even facilitate prospective pragmatic trials. And if we start to do all of these things, the great hope is that we increase trial access, we increase the breadth of outcomes and data that we can use to identify risks and benefits of a therapy. We can hopefully decrease disparities by broadening the types of populations we're able to investigate, and hopefully decrease development times and decrease cost. Now, with respect to evidence generation, I think what we're beginning to see is a blurring of the lines between traditional randomized controlled trials on the left and what we would call retrospective real-world data on the right. And in this slide, I've incorporated the different buckets that you might look at for data sources, and then some of the common sort of trial aspects that are strengths and limitations of each. Now, the traditional randomized clinical trial is prospective, often randomized. It has systematic site-based assessments and it's highly monitored. And so what you get is very high quality data, but on a more narrow population. What we're seeing more now in COVID is a similar design, but just using remote assessments in various areas of the trial. It still can be highly monitored, and it often still has a similar population, but again, it's a bit more patient friendly, but still high quality data. As you move more towards the right, you start to source the data more from the learning healthcare system itself. And so with pragmatic trials, you can still maintain prospective randomization, but you may be sourcing the data with less systematic assessments. You may use more selective monitoring, and maybe your population can be a bit broader. And then of course, real world data as we have been using it currently is often retrospective, non-randomized. It's sourced entirely out of routine clinical care, and it's generally unmonitored, but it has the benefit of speed. You can get this data relatively quickly, and also it accesses the broadest population. And so the appropriateness of any of these approaches really depends on the research question at hand. And if the intent is submitting this data to the FDA for a regulatory decision, we'd obviously urge you to come to the FDA and seek advice on whether it's fit for purpose. But I think the two areas I would want to get into a little bit more is the idea of decentralized trials and the idea of real world data, because those are two areas that are areas of interest for the Oncology Center at FDA, and also areas of opportunity to learn from COVID. So with respect to advancing decentralized clinical trials, obviously we've long felt this could offer advantages to patients, and there was obviously, it hasn't been deployed because there was some uncertainty with respect to operationalizing these aspects, and also whether there'd be data variability. But the COVID-19 pandemic forced us out of our comfort zones, and we have deployed remote clinic assessments with telemedicine, remote labs, remote imaging, remote administration of oral investigational product, and even remote site monitoring. And so it's been done. We currently have hybrid decentralized trials being run in many instances. What can we learn? So, the FDA is one of the few groups that gets a huge repository of patient level, excellent quality commercial clinical trial data sets. So we have the opportunity to learn from this data, but the issue is that there's not been a standard approach thus far on how to flag COVID-19 modifications within those patient level data sets. And so we have a pilot right now where we're asking sponsors to add some standardization to the data sets with respect to what sorts of modifications were permitted, and to flag individual assessments that were conducted remotely versus on site, so that we can look a little bit and see whether there's variability for different sorts of modifications, even flagging some of the outcomes like imaging assessments as interpretable or not, so we can look at data quality. And the website link is below on that pilot project. As far as real world data and real world evidence, clearly real world data is different from real world evidence. And right now, I think we have a lot of real world data. What we want to do is to create enough certainty around that data to allow it to be used as evidence for decision making, whether that be clinical or whether that be regulatory. So we've set up an oncology specific real world evidence program that's led by Dr. Donna Rivera, who's our moderator today. And its initial programmatic goals include to foster the development of consistent terminology in this space, to standardize and characterize quality metrics for data that's submitted from various sources, advance real-world endpoints, particularly real-world response rate, which is such an important endpoint in cancer discovery, especially in single-arm cohorts, and then support efforts broadly in collaborations to improve the source data through common data elements and efforts at interoperability, et cetera. So this collaboration has been rigorous through COVID-19, pretty unprecedented, with Dr. Rivera and I being able to participate in many interesting applications of real world data. And what we really learned is the speed at which you can get information and data out of healthcare systems. Still some work to be done, again, to create the certainty around that data to create evidence for regulatory decision making. So in conclusion, I think we can, should, and it's our responsibility to learn from the efficiencies and novel approaches that we've used for evidence generation during the COVID-19 pandemic. I think when we get the data, commercial sponsors, FDA, regulatory agencies, the National Cancer Institute, all of us can look at this data and use it to prioritize those modifications that will most benefit patients and provide efficiencies while maintaining patient safety and minimizing effects on data quality. And certainly from our perspective, the FDA's Oncology Center is going to continue our efforts to advance trial efficiencies, real-world data, patient-generated data, digital health, and decentralized trials. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you for the invitation to speak here today about the impact of COVID in oncology from a pharma perspective. My name is Khaled Abdallah. I am the Senior Vice President, Therapeutic Area Head for Medical Affairs in Oncology for Bristol Myers Squibb. I will be speaking today my own perspective, and I'm not speaking on behalf of BMS. So responding to COVID-19 crisis was a major challenge and was an unprecedented challenge. And to respond to that challenge, we rapidly understood the importance to drive decisions based on data, especially because of the fact that the challenge was unprecedented. And we very systematically collected more than 8,000 pieces of information from interviews and conversations with healthcare professionals, investigators, researchers, physicians across the globe. And that data was very systematically analyzed and categorized so we could understand trends and signals that we were observing in different geographies in different regions of the world. And with those signals, we formed an interdisciplinary team to analyze those signals and define specific actions to respond to the crisis. And after we rolled out this team, this cross-functional team to drive the response, we monitor all those actions and continuously refine and optimize the approach that we had to respond to the crisis. This was always data-driven, and that data supported not only the initial decisions, but also how we responded, adjusted, and refined the decisions implemented. The signals and trends revealed a lot of learnings, and I think we can say that the effect on clinical trials was more evident in 3 areas. The way recruitment happened, especially in the period between March and May, where most trials were completely stopped. As a result, also some of the sites couldn't see the patients, couldn't document the changes and the visits as per description of the protocol. And there was also some frustration from the PIs, from the investigation, because the rules were applied on a global level and trials were stopped across the board. And this was the crisis, the pandemic was not happening at the same level on all the regions. And that showed some frustration from some investigators about how general was the rule about stopping the trials. Some other learnings were important, especially around telemedicine and alternative treatment delivery, because those were the themes that we heard the most that helped to navigate the challenge of managing patients with cancer, managing patients under receiving a clinical trial, under research, how you keep the process going despite the fact that you are trying to avoid the patient to come to the center and reduce the risk for the infection. And we always kept very clearly our priorities in mind, which is protect the safety of our patients and personnel from BMS, ensure the scientific integrity and regulatory compliance, and continue to deliver on our regulatory obligations. Our actions from the crisis to recovery impacted significantly the way we worked. We leveraged new technologies to protect the patients and sustain the way we were doing research. And I think remote monitoring tactics on clinical trials, including access to EMR and EHR, patient and investigator virtual visits were implemented, and further exploring of central monitoring capabilities. So several initiatives and several innovations were implemented in a much faster pace during the crisis, enabling technology to support less personal contact throughout the pandemic. We also promoted agility and flexibility in our commitment to patients, allowing trial participants to visit alternative clinical centers. Also, we implemented several pilot projects to enable efficiency for use of telemedicine. And also we ship directly to patients drug when appropriate. It was important that every single change we did in the way we were running our trials and our research was based on data. And once implemented, we monitored and measured the impact of those changes in order to refine that process, always piloting first and scaling up later. Data-driven decision-making was a critical component of all we did throughout the crisis. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me to be part of this session. I'm Liz Garrett-Mayer. I'm a biostatistician and division director in ASCO's Center for Research and Analytics. I'll be talking about insights derived from real-world clinical data. In early 2000, quite literally all over the world, data collection efforts began to capture information on COVID-19, and in some cases, registries were developed that are specific to the intersection of cancer and COVID-19. All of these efforts have commonalities, most notably their rapid development, meaning an expedited process for case report form development, data collection, and database construction. Another common feature is that most of these registries do not require patient consent, as they do not collect direct identifiers such as name or patient street address. Some differences include the eligibility criteria. Some registries include cancer patients and survivors, including those who have been cancer-free for many years. Others focus on specific patients with specific cancer types, such as hematologic malignancies or patients who have active cancer. Another difference is the data collection calendar. Some are essentially cross-sectional, collecting data only at one point in time, while others collect data over time with longer-term follow-up, including data on long COVID and longer-term effects of the virus. Let me tell you a little bit about the ASCO COVID-19 Cancer Registry. We collect a limited data set, meaning that while we do not include direct patient identifiers, we do collect things like patient zip code and dates of key events like positive SARS-CoV-2 test date. We only include patients with active cancer or those who have begun adjuvant therapy recently. This is to ensure that the patients in the registry have regular interactions with their oncology practice and will be able to collect follow-up to 12 months or longer after the positive coronavirus test result. Shown here on the right is the study calendar for the ASCO registry. Lastly, we engage in agreements with oncology practices to enter data on their patients with some compensation for each patient who has data entered, whereas other registries allow data entry from patients from any practice. Electronic health records are the source for data that are used to populate these registries. Without patient consent, the approach for data collection is using the data available in the patient's charts. While this is convenient as the EHRs are accessible within the practice, the data included in the EHRs tends to focus primarily on what is needed for the management of the patient's cancer. So as a result, some key data elements related to COVID-19 may not be included in the patient's charts. Some examples of this are comorbidities or other risk factors relevant for COVID-19 outcomes, specific information about COVID-19 symptoms and use of anti-COVID treatments and interventions, including dates of initiation of treatment, duration, and any possible side effects. This can pose problems from the perspective of data quality. We can have variability in the quality and completeness of data at different sites contributing to the registry, and the reasons for missingness or lack of completeness can vary across practices as well. Source verification is usually impossible in this setting due to the de-identification and data collection approaches in many of these registries. So if something seems off in the database, we cannot go back and check the patient's medical record to make a correction in the registry database. As noted in the previous slide, we expect that there's an underrepresentation of potentially important data such as comorbidities and other medications like beta blockers that might not be present in the oncology practices EHRs for these patients. Lastly, most registries are not representative of the population they intend to represent. This can be due to lack of geographic representation or other factors that limit the data entry from patient subgroups. While the data quality may pose some challenges, there are steps that can be made to optimize the ability to make valid inferences from the data. First and foremost, although the data have already been collected, it's critically important to develop a study plan for each research project that utilizes the registry data. This includes things like pre-specifying the objectives and the methods and the statistical approaches used for generating results. I've listed a few topics here that should be considered, including defining the relevant patient population within the registry population, approaches for controlling bias, defining endpoints, and handling of missing data. Lastly, it's important to ensure that the data set is sufficient to address the research question with sufficient power. And if the sample size is very large, to not overinterpret small effect sizes. In other words, if the study is essentially overpowered, to ensure that the associations identified as statistically significant are also clinically significant when presenting results from these analyses. So although the data in cancer and COVID registries have their challenges, we are still seeing evidence emerging that is helping the cancer care community better understand COVID-19 in the context of cancer patients and management of their care. In the figure on the screen, we see results presented at the ASCO annual meeting earlier this summer by our group with the lead author of Katie Milam from Levine Cancer Institute. While age is a known risk factor for death due to COVID-19, in the patient population in this analysis, which included patients with active, regional, or metastatic solid tumors or hematologic malignancies receiving anti-cancer therapy at the time of positive test for SARS-CoV-2, we found the age effect is driven primarily by those with B-cell malignancies, shown in the center panel. While among patients with metastatic solid tumors, there did not appear to be increased risk of death with increasing age. So this is my last slide. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the panel discussion in a few minutes.
Hi, my name's Derek Angus. I'm at the University of Pittsburgh UPMC Health System, and it's a delight to participate in this workshop. I'm going to talk a little bit about the way in which there could be some lessons learned from the role of adaptive platform trials in COVID-19. Now, adaptive platform trials, and in particular trials that have an angle towards being more pragmatic, have really seen a huge uptake during COVID. There are three notable examples: Recovery, which is run predominantly in the United Kingdom; REMAP-CAP, an international trial with a large presence in the United Kingdom; and then a collaboration of 3 adaptive platform trials that included REMAP-CAP and also Active4, part of the NIH Operation Warp Speed initiative, into something called a multi-platform RCT or MPRCT. These 3 trials together in just the space of a year have enrolled over 50,000 patients, and they've generated a slew of high-profile findings that have really helped underpin the vast majority of the current WHO treatment guidelines for COVID. And so let's try to unpack a little bit more about exactly what these instruments are. So adaptive platform trials actually in many ways have been most developed in the early days in the cancer oncology space. And they're essentially the blend of 2 advances in trial design. One is the use of master protocols so that the same instrument can move from study question to study question. And the other is the use of adaptive features beyond traditional things, just like stopping rules, which are often, but not always, based on a Bayesian design. In terms of the 3 particular examples in COVID, there are some particularly notable features. So all 3 certainly use master protocols with amendments for every new study question. All three use an open label control. And so in that way, they seem more pragmatic, like a pragmatic clinical trial. But they protect against the potential bias of using open label by using pretty hard primary endpoints like organ failure or mortality. All three strongly emphasize ease of use and high acceptability at the bedside, which again is a head nod to pragmatism, with research questions with a high, broad stakeholder buy-in ahead of time, simple entry criteria, and lean data collection. And then all three in particular benefited from running in the United Kingdom and therefore ran on top of the UK NHR CRN hospital payment system, a financial incentive system run by the health system, the NHS, not by researchers, that is independent of any individual trial and that promotes across the system participation in research. REMAP-CAP in the United States also benefited by being fully embedded inside Cerner and Epic for the entire clinical trial architecture. And then REMAP-CAP and then PRCT have both managed to negotiate quite complicated matricing across multiple funding agencies. There are also some notable data and analysis features. All three trials are definitely complicated, but they keep the complexity under the hood so that the bedside and for the clinical trial site, it appears quite simple. So this might be analogous to an iPhone, a very complicated instrument under the hood, but quite simple to use for the user. And this is true regardless of the statistical model. So REMAP-CAP and the NPRCT are fully Bayesian, whereas recovery has run on a frequentist design. Unlike traditional pragmatic two-arm trials, they are quite nuanced. They are capable of estimating subgroup effects, and because they're testing multiple interventions, sometimes at the same time, testing drug-drug interactions. Importantly, REMAP-CAP and NPRCT have also managed to make headway using federated data streams. So they run off 4 separate data sources with a standardized common data model. And then the NPRCT has also managed to coordinate oversight by multiple DSMBs. There have been some trials and tribulations. All three have encountered a little bit of criticism, both because the statistics, even the frequentist statistics and the design have seemed a little bit unfamiliar, and because people get concerned about the lack of placebo. They've, in general, had very successful relationships with regulatory authorities in terms of sort of open road to conduct their trials, but regulatory authorities have still generally felt like if you wanted these trials to be registration trials, you'd still need to imbue them with more safety monitoring, use of placebo, better alpha error control, etc. And then I think all three have really struggled with the weight of just the massive amount of enrollment and the massive amount of continual updates and changes. That's put a huge toll on their coordinating centers. And then even though they've made some success in coordinating multiple funders and coordinating centers, I think all would say that they could wish for an easier path for integration. And this is just a schematic to show, for example, even just in the ICU subset in REMAP-CAP, the huge number of interventions being tested simultaneously. It's actually almost 200,000 separate randomized combinations. So in terms of lessons learned, the rate, size, and scale and success of these adaptive platform trials has, at least for the people participating in them, been perceived as revolutionary, and most of my colleagues in these trial groups would say there's no going back. There's also been a number of very positive comments from folks such as the current acting director of the FDA and several former directors that this is the wave of the future. But to be that wave of the future, there needs to be a little bit more work. I think, at least in the US, it would be really important to take seriously how could we have a US version of the UK NIHR CRN hospital payment system. We've talked for ages about federated data systems, a common data model with coordinating centers just speccing the data model and being able to tolerate data streams from different sources is essential. I think being much more critical about whether some of the traditional sacred cows of RCT methods are really necessary would be helpful, and employing more win-win designs for patients would help with engagement and enrollment. Still trying to tackle the incentives to get investigators and funding agencies to collaborate together, especially across countries, and an ongoing journey to try to make the reporting more explicit, more transparent, and easier to understand by stakeholders would be incredibly useful. With that, I'll stop there.
Hello, I'm Dr. Randy Heyer, Senior Vice President of Global Medical Affairs at Moderna. And you know, the subject here, there's an inherent challenge with such an analysis comparing a cancer clinical research to a preventive vaccine research. There's not a lot of parallels. You know, populations are different, benefit risk profile is different, trial endpoints are different, but there are some important themes. One is speed and agility in both research and development are important, collaboration, as well as diversity and inclusion. I'm going to cover those in my talk. It was certainly a remarkable achievement to go from the sequence identification of the SARS-CoV-2 virus on January 11th to an emergency use authorization on December 18th in the same year. This rapid development was characterized by the rapid flow of information, decision-making, and risk management. And I want to stress the importance of transparency, collaborations, clarity, de-risking the trials through purchase agreements, and the importance of diversity and inclusion in achieving this outcome. So go from sequence to the vaccine. And of course, this blue line here now depicts the case count in the United States. And certainly one of the factors that led to a rapid conclusion of the study was the great increase in number of cases in late fourth quarter 2020. I need to mention that the Moderna COVID-19 vaccine is under an emergency use authorization, is not approved nor licensed by the FDA. It's available under emergency use to prevent coronavirus disease 2019 for individuals 18 years of age and older. There is no FDA-approved vaccine to prevent COVID-19. And this EUA is in duration, in effect for the duration of the COVID-19 EUA declarative period. And for information on the authorized use of this vaccine and mandatory requirements, there is a fact sheet and some full prescribing information available at the website shown here. The timeline from sequenced identification to first clinical study was a record 63 days. It's just unparalleled. And what made that happen? Well, a lot of it had to do with the science, that we knew the science underpinning the vaccine was known, the protein was known. All vaccines are targeting the spike protein, the COVID-2 virus. Also, the mRNA platform technology allows us to start quickly and scale quickly, as well as this close collaboration with government, academic, community partners, clarity from regulators, and similar things like that. The speed from the clinical study to the first authorization was also very quick. We did have the standard phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. There were no corners cut. We did meet the FDA standards for safety and efficacy, but it was this sense of urgency that allowed us to work closely with the regulators to overlap these studies. And again, with those large number of cases occurring fourth quarter 2020, that helped with the number of events in the study. The original time frame was about 6 to 12 months, and the reality was about 4 months. And this was, of course, very important and led us to the emergency use authorization on December 18th. The trial was targeted to those at risk and zip codes for people at risk. The site locations as depicted here were across the country. Graphically show this distribution of sites with COVE and help speak to the representativeness of the COVE study. In any vaccine preventive study, safety is absolutely paramount. These were large, high-profile studies that were being rapidly executed, so having robust safety oversight was essential. There were essentially 4 layers of safety oversight, including the investigator, the medical monitor, a weekly protocol review, and the DSMB. Frequent meetings with the DSMB allowed the enrollment to proceed quickly. And there's shown, as depicted here, there's also a robust process for managing safety reviews, as we show. This was very helpful. The population in the COVE study was representative of the United States population at risk for COVID-19. We had nearly 6,000 Hispanic participants and over 3,000 African-American participants. It included a number of older age people, with 25% of the population over age 65. We also had very good representation from those whose work environment were putting them at increased risk for COVID-19, including educators, students, participants in the retail, restaurant, hospitality industries, and healthcare workers. And more than 8,000 of the COVE study participants live with a chronic illness. Diversity and inclusion, as I mentioned, were essential. And how did we achieve that? We were had a very concerted effort. It included education. We educated ourselves and stakeholders around the importance of diversity and inclusion and encouraged meaningful dialogue with community leaders. We practiced transparency around our protocol design, enrollment, demographic metrics, and we partnered very closely with trusted community organizations and experts to educate and inform and reach out to people. I was asked to talk a little bit about some of the inclusion exclusion criteria in the phase 3 COVE study. We did have the standard sort of pivotal vaccine trial exclusions. These included excluding people who are immunosuppressed from conditions, meds, bleeding disorders, excluding people who have events that might interfere with safety assessments, such as an acute febrile illness, or excluding people who might interfere, events that conditions might interfere with immunogenicity or efficacy endpoints, such as blood products and immunoglobulins. Obviously, allergies are important exclusion, certainly history of SARS-CoV-2, and of course, pregnancy or inadequate contraception. And what's important is we had a number of exceptions to standard exclusions, including inclusion of people with underlying medical comorbidities. This was a change in the phase 1, phase 2. Inclusion of people with HIV, living with HIV. This was unique in a pivotal vaccine efficacy trial, as well as we allowed people to have administration of another investigational vaccine or ongoing trial to treat COVID-19 only at the time of enrollment. Perhaps these would be excluded from per protocol analysis, but these were exceptions to the standard inclusion criteria. And this was important because I'm going to make sure that the trial represented the people who were at risk for COVID-19, so it was most representative. And then finally, what did we learn? Well, certainly speed of agility being extremely important, but clear demonstration of the unmet need. The rapidly scalable study design, execution speed, close interaction was pivotal to that. There's this tight collaboration between academia and the industry, the familiarity of investigational agents. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, the diversity of the study. It's important that we make medicines available to those in greatest need, and it's probably our most important take-home point. And finally, keep in mind that COVID-19 has increased awareness of clinical trials, and that's an important vantage point as we move forward, and maybe we can take something from this into our work in oncology. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Dr. Rob Kayla, Head of Clinical Policy and Strategy at Verily Life Sciences and Google Health, and I'm delighted to be part of this important set of presentations on what we've learned from clinical trials during the COVID-19 pandemic. Whereas many other presentations that I've heard might make it sound like we've had a set of resounding successes, I'm going to argue that we've had a number of great successes for sure, but also a number of problems and failures that overall have not contributed to the best picture globally for the conduct of clinical trials and their outcomes. In fact, if you look at this recent publication from the British Medical Journal, you'll see that life expectancy in the US has declined more than any of the other high-income countries that are in our category of expectations. Not only is that the case, but this has been going on for a while before the pandemic. So there's something about the relationship between the way that we generate evidence in this country and the way we translate what we know into clinical practice, which is deficient. And it's not only deficient overall, but this is driven by enormous disparities that are almost unique to the United States in the way that we operate. And so as we look at clinical trials during the pandemic, we need to take into account both the successes and failures and look forward based on what we've learned to what I hope will be a new clinical trials system. I want to start the review of at least what I think I've learned from the pandemic with this really excellent article that came out early on about pandemic research exceptionalism. And it really goes back to my fundamental belief that the pandemic has magnified problems that we already had in the system. And in many ways, as we've adapted, has shown us what we might do to fix those problems. But this is not just a matter of clinical trials during an infectious disease outbreak. It's a matter of fundamental ways in which we operate. And as we look at what we've learned from the pandemic, it will be important not to look at the positive aspects as exceptions, but perhaps as the new rules that should exist for routine clinical trials in any disease that we deal with. So what I'm going to do now is go through a list of areas where I think progress has been made and where I've had the opportunity over the course of the last 15 to 18 months to talk with a lot of people about what they believe we're learning, including many groups that I've been involved with attempting to make the clinical trial system better. And the format is the good and the bad for each of these areas. And in bold, you'll see quotes actually coming from individuals. They shall remain nameless for this presentation, but I'd certainly welcome any feedback about what you believe is good or bad about the way that I've put this together. And also really welcome quotes, because I think they have a tremendous impact on the way people look at issues and think about them. So the first is this bundle of consent, regulatory affairs, and ethics review. And I don't think there's any doubt that we've shown that in a time of emergency, people can come together and get consent done in a different way. Ethics review can be rapid. Central IRBs can work, and the FDA can expedite reviews. But the question is, all this has been done. Have we done the empirical work to know, out of all the things that we tried, which ones worked and how to define which ones work? And you'll see the quote here on the right-hand side: dropping of standards can be dangerous. And so a lot to learn yet in this arena, but certainly big changes with significant progress. One of my favorites, contracts and liability, something we always hate to talk about, but it's been amazing to see how quickly clinical trials could get started, where typically it might take 6 months to a year to get, for example, a company making a medical product and an academic center to agree to a contract. This happened in record speed. But now we need to look back and see were there any consequences of this rapid speed that were negative, and if so, what can we do to engineer around them? Because I can't think of a clinical investigator or a patient that's much in favor of taking 6 months to a year to agree to a contract for a clinical trial that everyone agrees needs to be done. The third area is digital, virtual, decentralized, platform, and hybrid trials. It's not just the conduct of the clinical trials, but the way they're conceived and thought about that's undergone a significant change. The good part of it is that many of these adaptations to the world have worked, basically. And of course, they're not new. There's not a single concept in this list that hadn't already been talked about, thought about, and at least implemented in one phase or another. But particularly as we've been forced to use virtual methods to bring patients into the clinical trials in a different way, rather than having them go directly to research centers. And as we've dealt with the time pressure of people wanting answers quickly, we've been able to move a number of these ideas forward in practical ways that now could really work. The bad of this on the right-hand side is that not only are we unclear right now about how to go through all these different formats and approaches to clinical trials and decide which ones to use in which situations, but we also have to confront the possibility that many of these changes have actually exacerbated the disparities that existed both in clinical trials and in clinical care, because different groups of people have very different access to technology and ability to use the technology. In particular, minorities and rural people have had difficulty, although we would also probably agree that digital technology offers the best way to bring different groups of people into the system. So a lot of work to do to sort through these issues. The next area of great interest to me is interoperability and access to health records. We did see a very big shift to the use of electronic health records for more information, and probably one of the most successful parts of the whole clinical trials enterprise during the pandemic was the UK recovery project, which benefited greatly from the complete collaboration with the National Health System in the UK, including access to the electronic health record data, where most of the follow-up is being done using the repository of EHR information. Still a lot of work to do. The technical capability has increased magnificently, and we've seen practically that it can work, but a lot of work to do to work out the governance as we get back into the more routine part of healthcare delivery. Related to this, of course, is data integration. The ability to put information together from different sources rather than relying completely on a person coming to a research center with a completely standalone electronic CRF, which is filled in by a human being, a pretty inefficient way to deal with the system that we currently have, but something with a lot of potential, and we've seen it work. Still a lot of work to do with data integration. Of course, involvement of people, patients, families, and carers in the system has been especially important, as many of what would have been clinic visits have been done virtually at home. But as I've already stated before about the use of digital technology in general, disparities can be accentuated by this system where different groups of people have different capabilities of interacting with the digital world. The use of novel outcomes and safety assessment. The FDA, in collaboration with industry and certainly the NIH, have gone to many different hybrid approaches to measuring outcomes. I think about people with severe pulmonary hypertension, where getting near a clinic in person would be dangerous to their very survival, and the conversion of 6-minute walk tests to a system that can be done at home, just as one example. And now we have to instantiate these changes into a systematic framework that enables us to get routine things done more quickly, but keeps the parts that really need to be done in the old-fashioned manner. And then we have clinicians, the involvement of clinicians on the front line. And here I would argue we still have a lot of work to do, although there was definitely a learning that we don't need GCP training for everybody involved in a clinical trial to get a valid answer. Many of the hurried up trials that were done to get answers were able to bypass some of the things that have become instantiated into the bureaucracy of clinical trials. But I would argue we still have major work to do to be able to involve the frontline clinician in a way that's efficient and enables them to also get their clinical work done. Analytical and design methods have had to adapt. But one of the most important learnings is that good old-fashioned randomization is still a critical element when it comes to therapeutic evaluation. And thank goodness for Dr. Fauci in many ways, but his insistence that we needed to use randomization rather than jumping to the conclusion has been so important. I'd also point out that we have hundreds of thousands of examples of poorly done observational studies making claims about effects on treatment. But we also have an evolution of the knowledge of what it takes to make a causal inference from observational data that we need to move along. And then getting near the end of this list, the meta-organization of studies and questions. And here I think the progress has been, at least in warp speed and many of the therapeutic areas, there has been a much better collaboration in identifying the most important questions involving all the stakeholders. But we still have a ways to go. Numerous analyses of clinicaltrials.gov have demonstrated that hundreds of thousands of small clinical trials were done that have never been finished and will never be reported. The so-called small crappy trial, a term that Janet Woodcock invented in a meeting we had between FDA and NIH, is all too common. And so our insistence that when we do a human experiment, that we have it carefully thought out about what it can contribute to overall knowledge is really important. And then next to last is dissemination. We've learned a lot about dissemination, the use of preprints, the use of Twitter to send information. I personally follow Twitter now for most of the science that I get because you can stay right up to date. But rapid communication also has its downsides. Errors have been made, false claims have been propagated, and a lot to work out about the dissemination of trials. And then the final one, and the one that I think really worked out well, is purposefulness. Clinical trials go well when everyone involved thinks that the trial is important. It's not just being done for the money or just to, quote, get a drug on the market, unquote, but it's being done to meet a real clinical need that's felt by everyone, where a better medical product or understanding how to use a medical product or another type of intervention would be useful. And I think in many ways, the clinical trial ecosystem has lost its way in terms of purposeful clinical trials. But if we look back, I think we can now reclaim a systematic approach to identifying the most important trials. So in conclusion, I think it's critical that we move the evidence generation ecosystem forward, taking what we've learned, putting it into practice, converting much more of the enterprise into purposeful, thoughtful, asking the right questions, and integrating digital technology into the clinical trial system. Thanks, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you to all of our panelists for the insightful presentations, where in each presentation there was a focus that really transitioned from what was required to conduct research and drug development in a pandemic to the how do we implement or sustain the valuable lessons learned that might accelerate progress and enhance clinical evidence generation for patients and clinicians. During this panel session, I would like to remind the public participants and encourage you to submit any questions or comments via the chat box. With that, I'd like to begin with Doug and Rob. So I'd like if each of you could please provide us with a 1 to 2 minute high-level reflection on what you heard and what the applicability of COVID as a catalyst for changes in clinical care, cancer clinical trials, and evidence generation is. So, Doug, you want to begin?
Thanks very much, Donna. What I think is number one, speed, flexibility, but no compromise of integrity and the rigor of trials. And if we do those changes, we can really have a big impact. Rob makes a really important point about recognizing that there's always going to be some downside to areas that we think are actually improving things. So we always need to be vigilant. A key example is for telemedicine. We think that this should actually be something that contributes to equity, but we need to consistently be concerned that we don't inadvertently create more disparities as a result.
Absolutely. I think those are key points. And Rob, any comments to add? All right. Well, maybe.
I think Rob is talking. Rob is talking. But
are you on mute?
Unmute, Rob.
Oh, okay. Let me.
Do you have to? Yeah.
Yeah, I had a
devices on. You're still on mute. Rob, we still can't hear you.
All right, now am I unmuted?
You are perfect now.
Okay, sorry, I had a camera problem, so I switched computers and got caught in the middle there. Just a couple of quick comments. I found it almost overwhelming to hear how much is actually being done in the oncology world, which I still will never forget my first encounter with our current president in the cancer moonshot meetings when he said there are politics, there are medical politics, and there are oncopolitics, and they are in ascending order of difficulty and complexity. But you know, my talk was mostly about the general field of clinical trials, and it's amazing the progress I think you all are making in the oncology world. And I would emphasize a couple of things about it that I think are really critical. One is that you mentioned having a glossary. I can't tell you how important I think that is. I find that as I interact with people all over the world, we use a word and people think they know what it means, and often it means something entirely different to different people. this thing about real world data versus real world evidence, the fact they're not the same is, I think, a great example of that issue. And the fact that real world evidence does not exclude randomization as a tool. And that was by design when 21st Century Cures was written. The second big issue to me is the integration of research and practice, which I heard a lot of good stuff today in what people had to say. But I'm guessing the panelists will agree with me that we still have a major problem, particularly in the US, with a frontline clinician who's completely overwhelmed right now with demands related to clinical productivity, and our best academic systems are struggling with it at a time when what we need is for everyone to regard learning as a critical part of clinical practice. But overall, you know, I'm heartened if we can take up these efforts and work together on what's effective and what's not. It could really make a huge difference in fueling much faster generation of knowledge. Last thing I'll mention is, you know, part of that is it's not just about getting new treatments discovered or on the market. You know, we have you know, what I referred to at the beginning of my talk. How can it be that we're inventing, you know, the most inventive society in the world, and we have the worst decline in life expectancy of any high-income country, and we're in last place by far? So we need the system to also evaluate the things that are on the market and figure out how to use them effectively, whether it's in combination or sequentially.
You know, Rob, I wanted to follow up on this just because, I mean, in your presentation, legitimately so, your right-hand columns were even sometimes more than the left-hand columns, which means the bad could be overwhelming. The question is, we made lots of progress. Many things have moved in the past year and a half. When we start thinking of those bads, and we are almost in tuned and programmed in the government, regulatory agencies, et cetera, to be way more on the safe side, how can we really prevent swinging back? Because the issue is that pendulum might swing back completely when we start uncovering some of those quote unquote bad part, risk part, and then re-entangle ourselves in regulation that could be as bad or even more sometimes. And, you know, there's a history to that.
I mean, it gets back to the glossary. When you say safe, you have a particular meaning, which I completely understand, which is the way it was before is presumed to be safe, and it is for us maybe personally. But I think we have ample evidence that the system that we had for clinical trials was not delivering the goods. And so for our patients, I think, and people who are making decisions about health and healthcare, the system was anything but safe. It was, you know, increasingly encumbered by bureaucracy that was useless. I mean, I was heartened in one sense to hear multiple speakers today say we got to stop reporting useless small adverse events that don't matter when we need to focus on getting the answers about safety and effectiveness and that balance. But this is not a new, this is 40 years old, this discussion, and yet we haven't cracked the case yet. So I'm a little despondent at the same time. So I think the key is these digital technology, especially, is a two-sided coin. If we use it right, it'll be miraculous. But it has a risk that if we, for example, play to the wealthy and highly educated in their use of digital technology, it'll, you know, there are many other examples. It can go the wrong direction.
I think, you know, building a little bit on what you both said, which is the need to balance both the rigorous nature of data collection with the potential for modernizing that data. I want to think a little bit about other types of evidence generation that could be complementary to our current system and randomized controlled trials. So thinking a bit about pragmatic designs and real world data, we first, I think Liz highlighted some examples of real world data that's been collected in the context of COVID. And I wanted to ask, you know, what did you learn from those insights around collecting real world data and data quality and some of the concerns and biggest challenges you had with COVID in this context?
Sure. So that's a great question. So my experience has been in COVID and before in the cancer space. I've also had some experience working with real world data from EHRs in the CancerLink database. And in those contexts, we're really focusing on medical oncology practices. And so in that case, what we have learned is that we have to consider the data that exists in EHR from oncology practices. And I think a lot of people, when they get into this, they don't realize that the oncology practice EHRs are primarily focused, and it should be obvious, I guess, on management of cancer for the patients that are in the practices. So there are lots of things that you may need to answer research questions that are not going to be included in those EHRs. So, so in terms of what we should be focusing on is the data that would reliably exist in those medical records from the oncology practice. So things like oncology treatments and outcomes, adverse events related to oncology treatments. What we've also learned is that when you're developing data capture tools that you should, you need to not only consider what's in the EHRs, but the understanding and ease from which data abstractors can get it from the data. So if you make your data collection forms complex, such that only a pharmacologist or a medical oncologist could understand them, you might not be able to get the data out if you need to do data abstraction in addition to looking just at the structured data. So I think that those are the things that I would say that we need to focus on, thinking about what's really there, what's reliably there, and making the data extraction relatively straightforward for the people that are going into the records and extracting that data.
Khalda, I'm going to take a couple of things forward. You mentioned many things that BMS tried to do on many levels, and that I would like also to pick Paul's brain on this. But some of the new technology, including, not a new technology, but the telehealth and telemedicine that you've used in data collection, how did you see, or other flexibilities, how did you see it really affected the outcome, one? And second, from the experience that you presented today, if you look back, what are the things that you'd say, you know what, I should have done this differently, or you would go and revise it in a way that would be more meaningful with higher integrity margin?
Yeah, I think the telemedicine was one of the things that were implemented the fastest, right? And adopted very rapidly. One thing that we observed is how we heard from different investigators, researchers, etc., the challenges that they were facing. And I think one of the learnings that we had was the importance of, once you see something being implemented, especially when you have a crisis such as this one that is totally unprecedented, you don't have a lot of learnings from the past about how to tackle this. So you have rapidly implementation of a lot of technologies happening in different geographies that will face different challenges depending on the scenario, depending on the setting, etc. So what we learn is that we have to keep that channel of listening to the challenge, aggregating that information, summarizing what is happening, and then using that to design different interventions. So one thing I think we all agreed, especially internally when we had our cross-functional discussions, and in the beginning we had that cross-functional discussions daily. So we agreed is that once we learn, we adapt fast, and we drive decisions based on data. Because everything you know before was not very applicable to the crisis you were facing. So that was, I think, the main takeaway. There's no right solution that is applicable everywhere in all situations, but you can always collect data on what is happening once something is applicable and adapt fast. But for that, you have to create that feedback loop on how to learn fast from what you're hearing and then adapt as you move. Make sense?
Yeah, but I'm going to take this to Randall, since you've done one of the fastest trial in history. And if you take your hat as the epidemic or infectious or vaccine person and put the hat of your other diseases, including oncology or otherwise, how do you see this as applicable? I mean, do you really see this as applicable? Do you really see that there are areas that can absolutely stick And what are the areas that can stick from your perspective, or what are the areas that you think it will never stick? The only reason it's been done is because there was danger, it was on TV, and the government was behind us 100%.
Well, that's a great question. Thank you, Samir. I think there's a couple things that really do stick. One was the close cooperation with the, in this case, Moderna and the government agencies and the private organizations, the CROs, others we're working with, was unprecedented. And that really did help. That helped a lot. Questions could be answered very quickly. Expectations were clear. We didn't have to second guess decisions. Decision-making was often very much in the open. And that was very, very helpful in speeding things up. The other thing that we spent a lot of time and effort on was the diversity and inclusion aspects, as I talked about. And I really felt that was also, it was very important because it helped the data that we generated be more acceptable by everybody, because we were going after the population specifically that were in trouble from COVID-19. And I think that was a major mover. It seems sort of, it's probably hard to objectify, but it was a really important mover in terms of the acceptability and interest in the study and interest in the data, interest in the outcome. And I've seen that continue even in studies we're doing today. So I think those are probably two of the primary takeaways that could be applied easily.
Yeah.
Building on Randall, on kind of the work that you guys did, you made specific efforts around increasing diversity within your trial, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what do you think you can teach other groups about how to do this well and how to do it quickly? And you mentioned the high unmet medical needs. Can these practices be replicated?
Absolutely. I think that one of the hallmarks was transparency. I mean, Moderna, I think, set new examples for transparency. We put the phase 3 protocol on the web. I don't know if that's ever been done before. So, I mean, I think that sets a standard for transparency, especially on a very large study that a lot of people have a lot of interest in for obvious reasons. I think that is a takeaway. So that transparency like that led to the collaboration, led to the trust was a major factor too. Transparency and trust. It's a scary business. Vaccination can be scary and can be emotional. Obviously, if somebody is diagnosed with cancer, would probably fall in a similar category. And so these factors of trust and transparency really weigh in. They're hard to quantify, hard to objectify, and they're extremely important.
Well, hearing all this, hearing Randy, hearing Khaled, and of course, Rob and Doug before, there are a lot, again, and maintaining this momentum. Regulatory has a big role in this. So there are many things that everybody's saying that, well, it has to be done, it should be done. And Rob comes and say, well, there's a discussion for 40 years and never been done. So how do you see things like simplifying reporting, unnecessary reporting, or simplifying endpoints? Or is there an effort currently that exists within the FDA that says, well, we need to do that, and this is the way we can do it? Or it's kind of like, well, let's get it moving, and then we'll see what happens.
Thanks, Samir. Actually, I think, I was fascinated by all the talks. Dr. Califf, particularly, I really enjoyed his talk and how he laid things out. And when you look at the things that have been done that have been really efficient and really effective, some of them are kind of completely out of our control. I mean, I was really struck by trial startup, weeks rather than months to years. So there are things that are outside of our control. There are things that are inside our control. As was discussed, these modifications that were done to result in essentially hybrid decentralized trial designs, which are ongoing right now, have been something that have no regulatory barrier per se. That's why the guidance was written, to show that this could be done.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it kind of comes down to what your last question was, which was, what have we seen so far that would suggest that each of these modifications, is there an issue with data integrity? Is there an issue with patient safety? We haven't seen anything large come up yet, but we're early on. Remember, most of the trials that we've received, at least at the FDA, most of the data was accumulated before, the data cut was before significant COVID, experience. And so I think as we get into the next year, our submissions are going to have a larger part of the data being done during COVID and with these modifications. So there's a lot to learn. I'm also very excited about Dr. Dorschau's work and the prospectively looking at some of these modifications so that we can get a better sense of, what are we giving up to gain what I think most people would agree are some really nice efficiencies for patients and for the whole ecosystem.
Okay, Donna.
Yeah, so I think maybe building a bit on Paul, what you mentioned about data integrity, thinking through data quality and the various ways we can think about this in terms of it's absolutely essential for study integrity, for analysis, evaluation. So within the pandemic, we've seen a lot of these different strategies emerge. I think there was a catalytic use of real world data. Mm-hmm. So what role do you see for real world data, for example, in external controls to evaluate new therapies versus standard of care, or even uses of pragmatic designs? And what do you think are the biggest challenges you saw within the context of COVID within evaluation of these designs?
Was that one for me, Donna? I'm sorry.
It was. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I think, Donna Rivera is our AD of real world evidence. And so she and I talk a lot about this. And what I can say is we're certainly putting our money where our mouth is and creating a program to advance this. I think what we can say that all of us learned, which was already stated, is the rapid ability to get data. What was also said is that data is not evidence. And that's going to be our next step. So what we've seen is incredible collaboration with the Evidence Accelerator. We have seen an unprecedented speed at characterizing a new disease and its outcomes in various populations, including those patients who have cancer. We can see use data very rapidly, right? So we can see what kinds of drugs are being used for whom and when. Our challenge now moving forward is to get outcomes that can tell us what the drug has done and make a causal inference. And I think that's the challenge. And so one of the things we're working with in our program is to take a look at real world response rate, because as everyone knows, the reason why response rate is such a valuable endpoint in oncology is because we can evaluate it and interpret it within a single arm cohort. And at least so far, a lot of our data has come in single arm real world data cohorts. That said, I know Dr. Califf is a big fan of pragmatic prospective randomized trials, and we should not forget that just because it is sourced from EHR doesn't mean that it can't be prospective and randomized.
So following on this, Rob, I'd like to hear your thoughts on, again, as a previous FDA commissioner and as a clinical trial expert. Yes, we all love randomization, but now with potential and with a caveat that, yes, integrity is there of real world data, could evolution of clinical trials become less and less towards placebo randomization rather than comparing to properly collected and highly relevant data that is real world data?
Well, see, I'll try to be brief here. I could talk for 6 hours about this because
I know, but I did not mean that though.
I understand. Let me first just refer people. There's a 4-part publication in Journal of one of the pharmacotherapy journals that's from National Academies that we commissioned when I was commissioner, and it just finally came out. It includes an excellent review of what it takes to make a valid causal inference from observational data. Jessica Franklin from ADION and a number of people from FDA and academia and industry were involved in that write-up. Dr. Franklin is the first author, and I don't have that at my fingertips, but I'll obviously it's available for downloading now. What I'd say is I predict that we're going to find that we've way overplayed single arm studies and inferences from external control groups. And it's not so much adjusting for factors, it's a time zero issue that's so hard to deal with. Knowing what that time zero would be when the decision is made about what treatment is going to be offered from observational data is very difficult because you don't collect all the information you want at that time. And usually when treatment decisions are made, it's at a time when things are changing or have just changed with the patient. And I think we've come a long way in terms of adjustment factors for causal inference, but the time zero problem is really hard. And I also think that when we have diseases with no treatment that are to a large extent have dismal outcomes in a short period of time, that's where it's still going to work. And I think we'll cycle through those. But once you get one or two treatments that work, you're now in a very different phase. And I think comparative effectiveness has got to be part of what we do, because often you're looking for smaller incremental effects compared to whatever the current standard of care is. And there's still room for placebo control on top of standard of care there that's going to be needed. And I mean, one thing we should have learned from COVID is that it is really hard to figure out from observational data which treatments are effective. And there are many, many, many mistakes that can be made. Again, not so hard if 50% of people die in the first 6 months of a disease and there is no treatment. You can pretty much deal with that. And I think the FDA and industry is doing a good job with that. I'll just make a couple of other quick points. I think the issue of what is truth about a person in a clinical trial data set, I think we've just gone the wrong direction. Truth has been defined as there's a data set that looks nice when you analyze it. There's no discrepancies in the data. The fact is, if you put the same person in front of two clinicians, we've done this work for 30 years, there's going to be up to a 25% difference in opinion about what the actual measurement is that you're making. And so the fact that we engineer a system where everything looks nice being the standard, I think we're going to learn now that we can do multidimensional computation. That is, now in electronic record systems, you can bring in 6 different views of that person in close proximity, and you see the variation, which is really important to understand if you actually want to know what's going on with a data set. But so I think there's going to be a lot of progress there, and I think it's going to upset the old come to a research clinic, have a study coordinator, make sure everything looks good. I hate to say this, even if it means change the clinical record to make it compatible with the clinical trial record. If any of you have never heard of that, I would urge that you go actually work with a research team and on the ground in a clinical trial. And then finally, we are all centers. I still love my paternal grandfather, who was a Southern Baptist minister. And this is clearly a case where we're all centers. We shouldn't forget that when it comes to moving the FDA, the leaders that you're seeing today have a point of view, but it's the reviewers and the individual groups that make the difference. And that's who industry needs to interact with. By the same token, the industry has a hardcore group of people who are used to doing things a certain way and have gotten very good at it. So changing that is difficult. And academics, almost all love, I call it the Christmas tree effect. They love to tack ornaments on the tree because they envision all the great papers they're going to write instead of answering the question. And I think when we look at recovery in the UK, all of those problems were dealt with highly effectively. I know Derek hasn't talked yet, but when you talk about Derek's work, he had to overcome a lot more stuff than the recovery trial had to, just to get simple things done because of all these factors. So we all this needs to happen in concert if we're going to make progress.
So let's take that recovery. And I would like to know, so Donna, I think you also want to know this. So how do we address, if we're going to do something similar to the recovery, and you mentioned some of that now, but going to Derek, if you want to implement something in the US, what are the interoperability solutions that you really have to think about and overcome, and is it even feasible?
So I think it's probably true that Martin and Peter would say that the NHS hasn't solved a ton of the technical interoperability issues. The main thing that they solved was the human factors. There was a complete commitment through the organization, which is what I would basically call the Boris Johnson enterprise. And it's not clear that it even had strong academic leadership. But there was a strong will among regulatory authorities and among NHS leaders. And it's definitely true that Richard Peto, as the statistician, is a charismatic and willful person. But it is not the case that recovery waited to solve all sorts of technical issues. There was just a strong sense that what really mattered was large-scale enrollment for simple questions. That there had to be randomization for causal inference, and there had to be just a bare bones collection of a few discrete pieces of data. And that was sort of the mantra. And REMAP-CAP also enrolled an ungodly number of patients in the UK. Even as an ICU trial, it was enrolling 1,000 patients a month of ventilated patients in the UK, and the rest of the world was all sort of tied up with the usual knots. So I think it's in certain ways less about recovery and less about REMAP-CAP and more about the fact that the National Health Service was really ready to do large-scale randomized trials for the entire community they served. And so I keep on thinking that it shouldn't be PCORI, it shouldn't be the NIH, it should be Medicare. It should be the biggest organization we have in the country that is responsible for paying a ton of care, for a ton of healthcare. And I would start by thinking about the incentive structures and the incentive structure through Medicare to make it in the interest of healthcare delivery systems to absolutely think that learning, participating in research is absolutely job one for superlative care delivery. And I put that way ahead of the technical issues. Yes, rolling out a common data model. Yes, getting us all into FHIR and all of it. But I would first of all think about who thinks this is their job. And I actually think I would put it on the shoulders of the payer, since it's the closest we have to the National Health Service.
But at the end, we need to find solutions. That's pretty utopian. What do you think? I mean, technically, in this, under the current circumstances within the country, it's going to be very difficult to take.
That's interesting. That's interesting you say that. I have yet to encounter a healthcare system that doesn't watch like a hawk its Medicare reimbursement. And every time there's some new financial incentive, which might be called a financial disincentive, they totally watch it. And they're very careful about trying to get on board. And Medicare tries to, I'm actually saying it because I'm not being utopian. I'm trying to be very pragmatic about it. I think healthcare delivery systems respond to Medicare financial incentives.
Yeah, I'm talking more from the payer's perspective, not only from, of course, Medicare, but other payers, third-party payers. So that's the issue, whether they will agree to those kind of approaches or not.
And again, here too, I would sort of not try to get them to all agree. I would just have sort of the biggest, baddest pair lead from the front and then watch everyone move.
I can't resist commenting, Derek, on that. I mean, first of all, I'd say whatever Medicare does, the private insurers are going to do, because Medicare is so dominant. The private insurers can't. They'll be so embarrassed, they'll go along. But the same health systems that Derek referred to, who will respond to a financial incentive on a dime, lobby heavily to prevent Medicare from doing just what you described. And, you know, I saw it full force with the cancer infusion debacle that occurred, you know, when I was at FDA. And I also saw it with the device, you know, amazingly, we still know more about the tires on your car than the devices that are in you. And it was academic centers that didn't want to have to record the information, that had a strong lobby against it. So it's a battle worth fighting, though. I agree.
I think that's some really interesting discussion, and you know, I think there's a really keen awareness that we have a lot of data. There's a lot of messages that have been going out, whether it's, you know, public health communication messages or even within our own communities as to studies that have been generated by real world data. And so within this increased visibility of trial results and the publicized interpretation of them, I want to ask Doug for a few quick comments, and then we will round this out by asking everyone for 30 seconds of reflection.
And may I just add one thing, Doug, to what you're going to be commenting on, because I'd love to hear, what is the NCI's plan? Like you just showed some NOCs relevant to digital health, et cetera. But are there anything that the NCI is putting together to be able to maintain something like this, like more incentive type of studies or grants, or et cetera?
Well, Samir, let me just say that I think that we want to work collaboratively with everyone to go forward so that we get the benefits from that have accrued for clinical trials with regard to cancer. Okay, this discussion has been fantastic, but it has not really been cancer focused and not as focused on people who have cancer. It, in many ways, it might be more involve the prevention or screening of cancer. I am much more optimistic that we are going to be able to sustain improvements in the area of clinical cancer treatment trials, because we already have many agreed upon principles. And I think we also have seen that during COVID, the FDA has approved many drugs for cancer treatment, and I don't see that stopping. So I actually am more optimistic than this overall discussion has had. My one point that has not been brought out yet is that I hope that in cancer treatment, we won't see the politicization that we have seen in other areas. For example, in COVID, where there are so many op-ed articles being written by people second guessing the people who are charged in the federal government, such as the FDA or the CDC, quibbling with their decisions. Overall, my feeling is that this undermines confidence in the overall process. I am in no way trying to suggest that people should be muzzled, but I'm just wondering about going through more regular channels rather than through the Wall Street Journal.
All right, Donna, you have.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at time, so maybe very, very quickly, if everybody just wants to give their one recommendation, high-level thought across the board, we can just start on my screen. Called, you're first. Please go ahead.
So I think the main thing in a crisis like COVID is that you have to use that opportunity to learn, right? You cannot waste a major crisis like this. And I think there's a ton of data that happens during this crisis. We really need to look into that and see what have we learned and use those learnings to extract as much evolution, as much improvement for cancer care as we can from the crisis.
I couldn't agree more. Incredible challenges to hopefully positive changes. Paul, you're next.
I would just end by saying that I think we all learned it's possible, that there are many more options than folks thought there were for commercial clinical trials of cancer agents. And I would just agree with everyone that it's incumbent upon us all to learn and prioritize what is the most meaningful to patients, what is the most efficient for the ecosystem that maintains data integrity and patient safety.
Great. Liz.
So my soundbite will be garbage in, garbage out. So I think we need to focus on data quality, integrity, and usability, and also a focus on rigorous methodology from the design of the studies all the way through the analysis, and pre-specifying research objectives every time we do an analysis.
Could not agree more in terms of methodology. Derek.
I think, I'm still a big fan of trying to get in front of the decision, whether it's with randomization. It's still the best suite of causal inference tools are deployed where you're doing something prospectively, but I really think it's about moving the clinical research machinery inside the clinical care machinery.
Randall?
Hi, I'm going to focus on 3 things that I think: speed and agility in both research and development, the importance of collaboration, that in close collaboration with industry, academia, NIH, government, regulatory authorities, and finally, of course, the importance of diversity and inclusion, so the trial represents the people that we're trying to reach.
I think they're all key. And so we'll conclude where we started with Doug and Rob. So Rob, you're next, and Doug, you'll round us out.
No, you forgot Paul.
Oh, Paul went.
Oh, he did?
Yeah, I think I heard him.
Oh, okay.
He was so concise that you don't even remember it. It was great. I mean, I'll just emphasize a couple of quick points. First of all, you guys on this call, other than me, are a bunch of winners. I've worked for 40 years on trying to simplify and make it better. I haven't carried the day, but all of you in your own ways have carried the day. And I think one key is to take what you all have done and try to synthesize it into something that works. I'm very heartened that the oncology world, as Doug said, it's the one area where life expectancy has gone up. Every other chronic disease has gone the wrong direction in the US, and that's telling us something. And the last thing I'd say is, please don't just work on new drugs, but work on what to do with the old drugs and how to combine things and to assess the value, because otherwise we'll have no money left for all the other diseases, because you're very successful, but we got to figure out how to get it in the right context so that holistic health can be taken care of.
Doug.
I would just echo 2 things that have been said. Number 1, to try to accrue more patients faster to clinical trials so we can find out what really works as well as what doesn't, and do it in an equitable manner.
Well, thank you all so much. It has been an absolute pleasure to discuss all of these topics with each of you. And I will turn it over to Samir to close us out.
Again, thanks for every one of you. That's really very helpful. And I think on session 6, we'll just summarize some of what we are putting together. Also, probably Rich will say a little bit about this. We're trying to put together a 1 or 2 papers out of this. And we will organize this post. We'll reach out to you because the NCPF would like to put out those as potential papers and recommendations. And Rich is, oh, here is Rich. So Rich, you can take it from here. But thank you very much. That was really very helpful.
Thanks, Samir. I think we're going to have to close out this session. We are running behind. So just want to thank all of you for a terrific set of presentations and really robust discussion.
Super.